Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a video that I hope will help some people out of a sticky situation and address a very common question that I get from viewers. It's not that, it's not uncommon that I'll get an email from somebody saying, Nick, oh my God, I took apart my insert knife model here, and suddenly everything's all wrong. I think I broke it. And they'll say things like, well, now the centering is all off. The blade is off to one side or another in the knife when it wasn't before, right? Or maybe now when I open and close it, you hear an ugly grinding sound, or it's super slow to open and close and takes a lot of force, so it no longer wants to flip open. It'll get stuck, or something like that. Or maybe there's suddenly a whole bunch of vertical or horizontal blade play. Horizontal blade play being where there's a lot of shaking back and forth when you just kind of try and wiggle the blade like this. You don't want that. Or vertical on this axis. That could be a thing that happens. That's not great, right? It's very much, there are lots of other things that can go wrong there. But if you put the knife together, if you disassemble it, put it back together, and things are way worse than they started, well, I got some generic advice to you. First off, though, I want to thank my Patreon patrons who make this channel and all the videos on it very possible. I appreciate you all very much. I also want to thank the couple of knife makers I chatted with about this just to get their feedback, right? Because they disassemble more knives than anything. And so I don't, they were happy to be anonymous in this, and so there we go. But thank you very much. You know who you are. Next thing, I want to just kind of reiterate that there are things you want to do and things you don't want to do. We're going to start off by talking about the things that you don't want to do, then we'll jump into the things you want to do. So, very first thing, and I shouldn't even have to say this, but do not get into watches. Okay, it's kind of orthogonal to what we're talking about here today, but do not. Bad. Only pain down that road. Next thing, obviously, I shouldn't have to say this either. If you've taken something apart, it is yours forever, right? There is absolutely no way that it is ethical, good, wise, or acceptable to take something apart, screw it up, and then return it to a retailer. That is so inconceivably sleazy that that's very, very bad. So once you put a tool on it, it is yours. You own it. And so don't you dare use a retailer for that, right? Next thing, if you take it apart and maybe you got some blade play, one thing that a lot of people get tempted to do is just to put a lot more force in it. Like, oh, well, okay, maybe the pivot's still loose. So I'm just going to take my screwdriver and I'm going to go beyond hand tight, because these are precision instruments, right? We really shouldn't need to put a whole lot of force onto them. But, you should be able to do any kind of tightening you need with a basic hand driver like this. Maybe with Loctites involved, you need to use a little, but still, think 4 times before using a bunch of force. But don't just try and crank on it, right? Don't hook up the wrench to a Torx bit and throw in a cheetah bar, like the thing for extra leverage, not a bar where a bunch of cheetahs hang out on the Serengeti. Different thing. Anyways, don't put a bunch more torque on there, because you're more likely to damage anything than anything. Also, don't try and bend things. Like, oh, it's off center. Well, if I just bend the whole knife. Or, oh, hold on. Wait a second. If I bend the lock bar, maybe the detent will get... No, chances are you're going to break things, right? If it needs that kind of level of adjustment, just send it to the maker. Let them do it. And actually, speaking of sending it to the maker, don't lie to the maker. If you take the thing apart, and I think, by the way, this is a very important reason why you should work with makers who are very happy to support routine maintenance of the tool that's done well, right? Watch out for makers who forbid disassembly, who use proprietary screws to keep their knives locked shut. That's a problem to start with, because sooner or later you need to maintain your tools. But anyways, if you take it apart and you screw something up, don't say to the maker, oh, it shipped this way. Oh, I don't know what happened. I dropped it and suddenly this screw is stripped. Weird. No, don't do that, right? Just say, hey, look, I took it apart. I was going to do some maintenance on it, and I screwed it up. It's not running right, and I need your help here. Just own up to it. Just be honest with them, right? Because that's going to make things just a lot easier throughout the process. And tell them, these are the things I tried to do. These are the things that didn't work. Chances are, if you email them with that, they might say, oh, on this knife, you actually need to do this. And you do that, and it works, right? But you wouldn't have gotten that if you weren't honest with them. The other thing that you shouldn't do is you shouldn't expect all the help to come for free, right? If you break something as you're disassembling a knife, or you put it back together wrong, it's no longer working, that's something you caused, right? That's your fault. right? And you shouldn't expect a maker who is a skilled person. You're paying them good money to put the knife together, right? You shouldn't expect them to work for free to fix it, right? So if you screw up a knife during disassembly and you need to send it back to them, not only are you paying for shipping there and back, but at the very least, you need to be prepared to pay the maker for their time. This is just the way it really should be. If you respect this person enough to buy their work, you should respect them enough to pay them to help you fix the problem, right? Maybe the maker will waive that, maybe they won't. Either way, you're paying them for their time. They're helping you out here. And so you shouldn't be shocked when that happens. And I stand 100% behind the maker who says, well, if you screwed it up and it's something you did here, I'm happy to help you. I'm going to make it right. Then I'm going to need to charge you a little bit for that because that's reasonable, right? Okay, those are the things you don't do. You should expect to help the maker out a little bit for their time. You don't lie to the people. You don't return it to a damn store. You don't bend things and you don't turn the screws harder. What should you do? Well, okay, let's say that you've got a knife here. This is a Spyderco PM2. I'm just using this as an example. It's running fine. But one of the very first things to do is, look, you're going to be at this for a little while, and so why not just make it safe, right? So you can take a piece of tape, and I would use masking tape generally, but I don't have any, and I'm just sticking it to my pants right now, and I'm going to go ahead and I'll stick it to my sweater. What this is going to do is take a little of the tack away, so to speak, and then I'm just going to put this guy right here on the blade, right? And what this is going to do is it's going to mean that, you know what? I am not going to cut myself on this knife anymore. I've just taken the blade out of the equation, so to speak. And this is just a good safety's sake thing. I'll do disassemblies on live blades on a regular basis just because, well, I'm getting to be pretty decent at this kind of thing. But at the same time, it never hurts, especially if you're going to be using it for a while there. So it's a good idea to make the blade safe if you're going to be working with it for a little while. Anyways, next thing, look around your workspace. Ask yourself, are there spare parts around here? Did I happen to maybe leave a bearing out of this knife? Is there a bearing over here that I can't explain the existence of? Are there extra screws that I haven't reinstalled? This is, by the way, one of the good reasons why it's a good idea to think about, making your workplace clean to start. And why I use this little mat here is because I know that when I set this down, there's nothing on the mat. And I just make sure that anytime I put something out, I put it in a defined place, right? But it's a really good idea to check that because, look, I'm going to be real with you here. I have absolutely put a knife back together without a bearing. On a live stream, on Instagram, in front of 200 people. Not my finest hour, but look around for spare parts. If you happen to see something there that wasn't there when you started, guess what? You probably need to put that back into the knife. Next thing, look over the knife. Do a quick visual examination. And there are a bunch of things you want to look at here. But for instance, are there parts of this that are out of alignment? So look at areas, for instance, where there are liners. Is there an area where there's a big gap, for instance, between the liner and the scale of the knife, right? Or if I'm looking at this guy, the Ortis, Civivi Ortis, by the way, in Spyderco PM2, am I seeing major gaps? Is something looking out of place here? Could there be something trapped between the backspacer and the liners? Are there unexpected gaps? Are there things that are out of parallel? Is your blade jogged off to one side or the other there? Is it the case that, there's suddenly a warp where there wasn't one? Look at the tent ball path, if you can see it. Look if you've got lubrication there. See if you left the knife unlubricated, that could be a problem. Look at some of the pins internally here. Like right here, we have the stop pin for this knife, the thing that the knife hits when it closes. If that's out of place, if it's kind of like trapped between the liners but at a weird angle, that can put everything out of whack and be a major problem. Did you leave out a standoff? That kind of thing. Does everything look seated? Basically, does this knife make sense? Is there anything that I'm just looking at it like, that seems weird. That seems out of parallel. That seems wrong, right? And so that's definitely a factor. Next thing, after you've looked at it, that should give you some hints, right? Like, oh, there's something trapped there. But if you see nothing, then the next step would actually be to try loosening things up a little bit. Just kind of back off the pivot a little bit and then retighten it to a reasonable tightness standard. If that doesn't help, well, then it's probably not a pivot issue. And in fact, in that case, I retightened it too much, and so now the blade is super slow. So again, just adjust your tightness. And then similarly, for centering issues, very often it can be helpful to go and readjust the screws in the back here. Even if it seems a little, counterintuitive, so to speak, the screws that are not the pivot can actually have an effect on centering. If you put the knife together with your pivot way over to one side, and then you tighten these back screws, you could actually have a bad time, right? That could cause you some major problems, and it could make the knife seem like it's suddenly out of center, when in reality, you've just got everything put together in a weird way. So sometimes loosening, even just partially loosening the screws and then retightening retightening them is enough to allow everything to come back into position. And I would always tighten the pivot first in those situations. It just makes it easier. This way the right tension is here, and then everything else can kind of relax and then work back together. But anyways, so loosening things up a little bit and then retightening them can actually help. Next step, if something's still wrong, then go on ahead and back it up and try it again. Right, so I'm just going to take apart this guy right here. I'm going to take out the pivot screw. And by the way, good practice, as always, is to take the knife apart in a way that's predictable, right? So I have this mat with these pockets for a reason. I put the pivot screw here, and then the next screw back, toward the tail of the knife away from the pivot. Turns out you need to use the right size bit. It's one of those things that, by the way, check if you're using the right size bit. And then I'll put the next one here. And if you're really concerned, you can actually draw the knife or trace the knife on a surface or something like that, and then just set the screws on the drawing exactly where they came out. That's a really good way to make sure all your screws are in order. But anyways, you're going to want to make sure that you've got, come on, get out of there. This little screw is not wanting to leave its home. And I can't say I blame it right now. There's less reason than ever to, but come on, dude. Work with me here. Come on. So, this is not how I expected this video to go, but I suppose I should be expecting it. By the way, as I'm dealing with this, hey, better living through plugs. If you're curious about this or any of the other tools I'm using today, go ahead and check out nickshabazz.com/tools, because using good tools can be very helpful. Come on, get out of there. There we go. Finally. So anyways, take the thing all the way back apart again. On the PM2, actually, you're just usually going to rotate out on the lanyard tube, but whatever. Now the knife is fully disassembled, and I can see exactly what's going on in here. So one of the things that's very, very common that happens is, for instance, I take this knife apart, and I do everything right. I put it back together, and then I put this down there, and then suddenly I put down on there like a... Well, for instance, let's say I've got a piece of cloth that I'm using in my disassembly, and this particular cloth I'm using actually has little threads, right? And so it's very possible that something might get trapped between your washer and your scale as you're putting it back together. And if I were to put this knife all the way back together, what you would end up finding is that things are actually out of whack, right? Things would be off-center because suddenly those washers that are supposed to be parallel, one of them's all jacked off to the side here, right? And you don't want that to be the case. This is going to squish a little bit, but particularly if it's something on the thicker side. This can even be just like a piece of old thread locker or something like that. A little something. These are, again, very precision-made machines. And so if you end up with something that is trapped between a washer or something like that, you're actually going to have a bad time. And so one of the very best things you can do is just do the disassembly again. Just back up and retrace all of your steps. And, even, okay, re-lubricate it, I don't care, but just clean off everything and make sure that there's nothing trapped underneath there. Wipe off all of the surfaces again. Make sure that as you're putting things back together, you're doing so with a clean surface against a clean surface, lubricating things properly, going the extra mile to absolutely make sure that you are going to, this is just, it's good sense, and it will very often fix the problem, and you might not even know why, right? It could be that an eyelash fell off as you were putting this down on there, got trapped under there, and then as you're taking it apart, the eyelash falls back onto your thing, and you're just going to be like, what? Was there a poltergeist? No, probably not. But anyways, backing up can do that. It can definitely can resolve some issues. It can also be the case that you cross-threaded a screw. That is, you put it in at the wrong angle or something like that. This is another reason why you don't want to use too much torque, right? Because that can be an issue. But look, there are 1,000 reasons why something could go subtly out of whack, and very often just redoing what you just did will fix it, right? And so you don't have to worry about it. You put it all the way back together, and there's not a problem. But let's pretend that I have done that. I've put this back together, and oh wait, there's still a problem. Something's out of whack. Other questions you want to ask yourself. One thing to do is to check the screws, to look at the different screws on the knife. So on this paramilitary 2 here, and I'm keeping these oriented, by the way, as to where they came off the knife, but I believe these to be the same screw. Actually, I might be lying to you. It could be the case that actually, it looks like the pivot screw here. See, it's that easy to make a mistake. Even if you are not a brilliant man, you can screw that up, right? So it looks like this screw is actually a little bit thicker, a little bit wider than this screw is here. And this one goes here, and this one goes here. If you put this guy back together and you didn't understand that, given it might not even go in, right? But at the same time, if you put this guy back together and you've put the wrong screw in the wrong place, you end up having a bad time, right? It could be, for instance, and another thing that you want to worry about is even if the screws look like they're the right diameter and whatnot, and the right thread pitch and one of them might be longer than another. This is very often the case in knives where, for instance, the clip... Oh, do I have one of these like this? Okay, this is the Rayot Knives Tribute here. This has a screw that's holding this carbon fiber inlay down against the scale, and then it also has clip screws in the back here, and these are going to have to be longer than this one is. But if you install one of these in this position, then that's going to be pushing through and causing some trouble. It might even go into the blade path at that point, which is going to cause a terrible scratch, right? Maybe not a scratch, but at the very least, it ain't going to be pretty, right? So making sure that you've put the right screws in the right positions. And this is another one of those things that you want to take a look at. Like as you're looking at it, look in the inside here. Do I see screws sticking out in there? If that's the case, then chances are, you know what? You got yourself the problem, right? You swapped some screws around. So look at your screws. Ask yourself, okay, are these all the same size? Is it possible that I've put the wrong screw in the wrong location? Could I have put the pocket clip screw in the pivot and vice versa? In some cases, it's possible, but due to subtle differences in length, you might not notice it at first. So checking to see if that's a factor is, well, a good idea. There's another good reason why it's a good idea to videotape your disassemblies, right? Even if you're not planning to upload them anywhere, that way you can go back and check the tape and see, okay, I took this screw out here, and then I set it down here, and then you just watch that through the rest of the disassembly. Oh, wait, I installed that one here. And you can undo things. Or there's, look, process of elimination, but that's a common other source of issues. Another thing to worry about are the pivot is the pivot. Very often, a good maker will very often... Interesting. This is thread locked in place here. So I'm not going to use that as an example. I'm not going to, go there. But here's, I think the Civivi's got this thing going on too. If you're disassembling two knives at once, the danger rises because you have bearings and screws from multiple knives around. In this case, all the screws are DLC'd black on the Ortis here, so it's not a major problem. But as you're looking at, for instance, a pivot of a knife, one of the things you're going to notice here, and yeah, we're just going to go whole hog here. I'm going to do as I say, not as I do, people. But anyways, I'm going to take this guy apart, and what you're going to see is that the pivot itself does not insert in all of the relevant ways, right? So, for instance, as I take this guy apart, that is your cue to come apart, knife. As this knife comes apart to me, really, bro? There we go. Come on. Anyways, one of the things you'll notice is that this is not a... there are many barrels in the world that have a D shape to them, right? Where they've ground off a little portion of that makes the barrel D-shaped, and therefore the barrel needs to go, and this is, by the way, this can be the case for body screws too, but where you need to insert this part of the Chicago screw here, this part of the pivot, in a very specific orientation. The D shape needs to face backward. But on some knives, actually, there's something more subtle. I'm going to see if I can zoom in and show you this. On this guy right here, do you see that little region right here? I'm going to see if I can get the light glinting off it just right. Yeah, right there. There is a little gap in this pivot screw here. And on the scale itself, where the pivot inserts, you will see, if I look at the right chunk of it, there is a ridge. So that gap right here needs to make sure that it goes into that ridge. If you put that gap someplace that isn't that ridge, you're going to have a bad time because the pivot is going to be stuck out here, right? If I put this back together incorrectly, the pivot is going to be stuck out here. And then maybe once I put it back together, this pivot isn't going to be quite long enough. And so I'm going to have to apply different force. Or another possibility is that later on, just by using the knife, it rotates the pivot and then suddenly it snaps down into place and things are too loose again. So you've got yourself a problem. So make sure that that nothing is like the keyed pivots are inserted properly. So if there's a D-shaped side to it, make sure that that's facing the right direction, that it's inserting in the proper way, right? Look for bumps, look for shelves, look for all of the various things that can make a pivot not free spinning. If you've watched my channel a bunch, you've got a good sense of what those things look like, right? But at the same time, that's another really good approach to take. Another question to ask yourself is, for instance, on the Ortis here, there's this little backspacer guy. I'm sorry, the stop pin guy. And then there's also this little guy, which goes into the backspacer and is the lanyard tube. Maybe you put the wrong post in the wrong hole, right? You might have taken this guy out and thought, okay, that guy needs to go here. That's my stop pin. It's not the right diameter, so you're going to end up with a whole bunch of blade play on that. But if you put things back together improperly, you're not going to notice that, right? Or it's going to have a lot of looseness there. So ask yourself, okay, there is this pin and this pin. Is it possible that this pin could go in this hole or vice versa? Could that be the source of my problems? So checking to see if there are pieces that could go in different holes. Another thing to check is if there are pieces that could be in a different orientation, right? Sometimes backspaces are actually, you could insert them in either direction. You could put it in like this. Hey, actually, this is a good example. If I put this backspacer back together like this, then not only am I going to have an awkward part, but then the blade's going to come in and hit this, and it's not going to fully close. That means it's not going to flip. So if I put this in backwards, I'm going to have a bad time. So just double check to see, look, there are a bunch of pieces here with an orientation. Am I sure that they're back together in the proper orientation? If not, well, I should become sure, right? You should check those kinds of things. That can be useful. Another thing that's worth noting, actually, and I'm glad I took this guy apart. Hey, better living through mistakes. Anyways, another thing that you can look at here on pieces like this, look for signs of wear. If you're trying to figure out, for instance, which side of a liner, for instance, or a washer, especially when you get like a bearing race, that is a separate stainless steel washer that goes underneath a set of bearings, one side of that is going to be completely smooth because that's always been the side that's against the liner. It's against the liner here. And the other side is going to have a little ring worn into it. Much like, for instance, the liners on this knife right here have a little ring worn into it from where the bearings ride. So this little ring tells me, as an intelligent human being on occasion, looking at this knife, that the bearings go against this surface. And similarly, I have a matching ring on the other side, on the blade itself. And so I know that the bearing needs to go between this surface and this surface. Similarly, if you're looking at a knife that has phosphor bronze washers, one of the very best ways to tell is that this side of this knife right here has no sign of wear, really, at all. There's no rotational wear to it. Versus this guy has been polished clean by, well, presumably movement of the blade. And actually, on this case, with the PM2, there's actually a separate thing, because on the PM2, the washer doesn't actually go all the way down. It's kind of a bushing style thing. And so what you see here is that the washer here is partially shielded by this little ridge right here. And so this is the only direction that this washer can go down, right? I mean, you could probably flip it over. It might be okay, but you don't want to, right? It was put together that way by the factory. You trusted these people to make the knife. Go on ahead and do that. So that's another thing you can check, just to see whether the wear of the part. So similarly, if you're not sure where the lock bar goes, although that's kind of silly, right? But you can look for the wear of the lock of the tent ball and the lock face, etc. So look for signs of wear. That'll give you a sense of what's touching what's moving, etc. And make sure that all the parts that should be moving are moving in the right direction, etc. So that's good. That's something you want to keep in mind. Next thing you're going to want to do here is to look for burrs. What I mean by a burr is that, sometimes it could be the case that there, during machining, there was a little piece that kind of came off of like as it was machined, there's a little piece of metal still hanging out there. The end. This totally happens, right? It's a situation. It's a thing. But what might have happened is you put it back together, and as you put it back together, you accidentally folded that burr down. And now suddenly there's something interfering with the lockup, making it problematic. So just look at the relevant pieces that could be moving against one another and see, is there a burr over here that's now folded up and hit the stop pin or something like that? Look for those burrs. And if you see one, just kind of move it back and forth and it'll break right off, right? Or you can hit it with a sharpening stone. Again, these are going to be very, very tiny little thin things. They frankly could even cut you. Very often they're very sharp, but look for those kinds of things. Make sure that the relevant parts have smooth edges and that edge has it like bent over or something like that, because that could be another issue there. So anyways, all of those things are things you might look at inside of the piece. You would also want to to make sure all your liners are oriented correctly. And again, using the trick of looking for where the bearings ride is very useful there. Make sure that everything is actually clean. Make sure that as you're putting it back together, okay, yeah, all of my various, like here, I'm going to clean out the bearings. Because another area, by the way, where you can get kind of a crunchiness to it is if you've got grit inside the bearing race here. If you've got a bunch of stuff kind of stuck up in there, that's going to cause a little bit of crunchiness as these balls try and roll over it. Or if you've got a bunch of grit on this area right here where the detent ball runs, you know, if you just finish sharpening the knife and you've got a bunch of diamond dust in here, that's going to slow things down. And in fact, it's going to make the action markedly worse. It's going to be super duper crunchy. So cleaning things out can actually be a really helpful step as you're doing this, right? So all of those things can be really useful as you're putting the knife back together here. The other thing that so one other thing that very commonly happens as you're doing something like this, you're putting it together, and one of the other ways that things can screw up, even though you've done everything else right. Maybe you strip a screw. Maybe one of the screws strips. And look, this can happen for a bunch of reasons. Very often it's because you were using perhaps a bad driver. If you have a bad driver where the tip of it is rounded off, it's going to not grab well. And if it doesn't grab well, it's going to grab poorly. Yeah, you know, the more you know, right? And if it grabs poorly, then you might be in a situation where it's tearing away material rather than turning the screw fluidly. And if you do that, you're going to have a bad time. By the way, make sure that you haven't installed bearings where washers should go and vice versa. But anyways, sometimes it can happen that you strip out a screw and that you are no longer able to turn that screw. There are a couple of things that you can do in that kind of situation, although very, very quickly, this is something where I would get the maker involved, right? But a couple of things that you can do is, one is to try a fresh driver bit. I've got videos about this, but like I said, if you round off one of the corners on a Torx bit or something like that, then it might not engage fully. And even despite your best efforts, it might not actually go, you know, you might not be able to turn that, even though there's plenty of, there's plenty of gription on the screw itself. Another approach that you could take is to make sure that you're using the right size bit. Right? This is why people ask me, Nick, I just want to buy a bit for my disassembly. What bit do people usually use? I generally advocate that you get a full set. This is like a Weehaw set with a ratchet and everything like that, although I've put an iFixit driver in here just because it's better. But this gives you a bunch of options, right? I got T5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Do I ever use T7 or T9? Almost never. But very rarely makers will end up using that. And if you're trying to do a T9 screw with a T8 head, you're going to have a bad time, right? It's going to be unfortunate, and it's going to be unpleasant. And I completely forgot to lubricate the detent ball on this guy. Anyways, I digress. But as you are, you're going to want to make sure you're using the right screw. That is a pretty straightforward sort of thing to consider. And so make sure you're using the right screw, the right bit at the right point. Another thing that you can try to do, actually, is to put a rubber band in place. This is something that, you know, has very occasionally worked. And usually, if you're to that point already, once you get the screw out, you leave the screw out and you ask the maker for a different screw. That can make things better. Come on. Why are you not? There we go. So you will, and so what you would basically do I have a rubber band handy? I do. So what you could do is do something like this, where you take the rubber band here, and then you grab the right size driver. This isn't actually stripped, so this is going to work very poorly, but you basically use the rubber band as an interface between the screw and the driver, and then you use that to turn it. That can give you a little bit more grip. And there are also other products that you can use on that. You know, I'm sure machinists in the comments will let us know other approaches to it, right? But that you can see if a different size screw bites a little bit. Sometimes it's the case if you're really trying to get something out of there for the last time, it might even be worth trying to see whether like a hex bit works in what used to be a Torx bit or something like that. You can make some things, but chances are, if you're already to the point where it's stripping out, you probably want to get the maker involved, right? Because they're going to have better tools for this. They are machinists pretty much by definition. So that can be very helpful, just to reach out to them and say, hey, look, I stripped the screw. And they'll probably say, okay, cool, send it home. We'll get it out of there. There are other approaches you can take to removing a stripped screw. I'm not going to get into them because very often they can be, well, frankly, dangerous, and they can cause you some difficulty there. So I don't want to go into there. But nonetheless, that is very much a possibility. But then finally, it might be the case that, you know what? I can't get this knife back together. This knife is running poorly, and I don't know what's wrong. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. But nonetheless, sorry, Buffalo Springfield reference, you might just be in a place where you know that you screwed up and you can't fix it. At this point, contact the maker. Be honest. Say, hey, I took it apart. Something went wrong here. Like I said, very possible that they might say back to you something along the lines of, oh, well, okay, one of the most common things that happens with this model is that people put the backspacer in wrong. Or, oh, actually, this backspacer looks a lot like this one, but if you swap them, you're going to have exactly that problem. So try that. They might be able to troubleshoot it just remotely and get you right on the right track, so to speak, without even taking a look at the knife. That's a very real possibility. And again, it's great when it happens, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes instead, you just got to be honest. You say, hey, I screwed it up. What can I do? At that point, you explain what happened, and you say, hey, I would be very happy to pay you for your time if that's the way things need to go. Please let me know where I can ship it to you, how we can work this, right? Again, if it's your problem, if you screwed it up, just double checking. I have all these things in place. This is in place. Stop pin's in place. Good. Put this back together. At that point in time, you ship it back to them. It's a good idea to tape the blade and to listen to any other instructions they give you, right? They might say, okay, well, look, because you're coming from Kazakhstan, then I want you to make sure that you ship the blade separately. I don't freaking know. But, follow their lead. Do what they ask you to do and then send it back. And then be patient, right? As they're putting it back together, you're probably not the very top of their pile, so to speak. They're busy making knives for paying customers. Of course, you show them some compassion as you're doing all that. But then at that point in time, they can, take a look at it and hopefully fix up what's going on for you and make not a problem, whatever was a problem, eventually. And maybe they'll contact you and say, hey, look, it's this issue. We're going to need to replace this part. It's going to cost a little bit of money. At that point, guess what? It's your problem, right? You screwed up, unfortunately. And so, again, be respectful, be kind about that. But anyways, that's kind of my approach. That's what I would advocate in a situation where things have gone wrong during a disassembly. If you take all of those troubleshooting steps, actually, one other thing I'll highlight is if centering is off, I have a whole video on how to fix blade centering. It doesn't always work. Sometimes centering is just wrong, right? Sometimes the knife just isn't of great quality to start with. If you get it out of the box and it's poorly centered, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be poorly centered for life. But anyways, I digress. And that's working like a charm. Perfectly centered. Life is good. But anyways, those are my thoughts. Those are my approaches. Those are the tools, the tips I usually give to somebody if it's like a good friend and I'm trying to walk them through it or something. But hopefully it'll be helpful for you all, and hopefully it'll save you a trip back to the maker, and hopefully it'll save the maker some time too. So hope this has been interesting to you, that you learned something today that gets you out of a tight spot, and most of all, that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of the day, and that all your disassemblies go so smoothly that you can forget the contents of this video immediately after watching it. So, have a good one, everybody, and bye now.